Welcome to Geopolitical Futures video. My name is Jonathan Roth. Joining me from Austin, Texas is the Director of Analysis for GPF, Jacob Shapiro. Jacob, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Jacob, you folks at GPF have just written a special report on the very nature of geopolitics. From GPF's perspective, what really is geopolitics? Can you define it?
Yeah, it's a word that is getting tossed around a lot, I think, in popular culture, and people don't really know what it means. I think a lot of people just use it as a fancy synonym for international relations, and for us, that really isn't what it is. For us, geopolitics serves two purposes. First of all, there is a certain content inherent to geopolitics, and that content is much simpler than you would think. It is really just the idea that geography defines human behavior at the individual level, but also at the communal level. And the larger your human community that you're studying, from a family all the way up to a nation state, geography is the thing ultimately that sets the boundaries for how that particular entity can develop over time. It's also, however, a methodology. It's a way that we can cast aside things that are unimportant and focus on the things that are important and see where power and the exercise of power in politics are going to meet with those geographic factors that we talked about.
Interesting. Okay, you make a lot of really interesting points in the special report. One of them is that every nation state has certain imperatives that it needs to survive. So for example, I'm wondering if you could go through what some of these imperatives would be for a country like the United States. What does the U.S. need to survive as a state?
Sure, and the United States is fairly unique among most nation states, because most nation states do not fulfill all of their strategic imperatives. But when we think about the strategic imperatives that a country like the United States has, the United States has been able to secure most of them. You have to think of the United States, first of all, as, it began as 13 colonies breaking away from Great Britain. The first thing that the 13 colonies needed was some measure of strategic depth. They needed ground that they could fall back on in case the British attacked and tried to take over. Because of the geography of North America, that strategic depth meant you needed control of the Mississippi River, and that meant that you needed control of New Orleans. If you look back at U.S. history in a lot of the 19th century, control of New Orleans is really important. When the British attack in the War of 1812, they attack Washington, D.C. and New Orleans. Andrew Jackson becomes a hero because he defends New Orleans. The Mexican-American War and the entire conflict between Mexico and the United States is a battle for who's going to be the dominant power on North America. Mexico had an imperative to try and control the Mississippi River complex. So did the young United States. Santa Anna gets defeated in the 1830s, and the United States rises from there. Once the United States is able to control the Mississippi, it can start to look west. U.S. policymakers called this manifest destiny, but when we analyze the United States, we just think of that as the United States fulfilling a strategic imperative. Once the United States was able to control from the Atlantic to the Pacific, then the issue was trying to prevent anyone from being able to attack either one of those oceans. That necessarily means that the United States had to become a naval power and somewhat an imperial power. The Spanish-American War, the United States takes over the Philippines, becomes much more involved in Cuba, gets Spain out of the Western Hemisphere. And then once all of those things are satisfied, the thing that the United States has to do is prevent another power from rising that could build a navy to challenge the United States. So as you can see there with the United States, each imperative sort of naturally leads into the next one. And it's all based on what geography dictates is the threat to the United States, and what are the things that the United States must try to do in order to protect itself from those threats.
Okay, so another point that you make in the special report is that there are obviously constraints on countries. So for a nation like the United States, what are the constraints that it's facing today?
The United States, again, is remarkable among most nations in that it does not face as many constraints as others. Now, the United States cannot, even though it is the most powerful country in the world, we've seen multiple times, it cannot commit large numbers of forces to win ground wars in Eurasia. The United States has not gotten what it wanted out of the Second Iraq War. It has not been able to bring any kind of stability to Afghanistan, which is where empires go to die. The United States, Vietnam was not a war that I would say that the United States was able to achieve its strategic objectives. And North Korea is in the news a lot. The United States really didn't achieve strategic objectives in the Korean War either. So the main constraint for the United States is also the thing that makes it safe. The United States is far removed from the rest of the world, and it can't dominate the rest of the world. What it can do is it can use its formidable navy, its formidable economic resources, and try to build a global system in which certain powers, let's say the Soviet Union it used to be, Russia, China is facing this today, cannot rise to the ability of challenging the United States. But constraints are much more obvious to see in a country like Iceland or a country like even Germany. Iceland, no matter what it wants to be, is never going to be a global power. It just doesn't have the economic, geographic, physical resources necessary to do that. That's very obvious. It's much harder when you get into a country like China or a country like the United States to see those constraints, but they absolutely are there.
Interesting. Okay, so how does GPF put all of this together to make predictions? Obviously, I mean, this is the whole premise, is that geopolitics is predictable. So how do you do it?
Well, look, there's that George, who is our founder and CEO, always quotes that Sherlock Holmes quote that if you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, is going to be true. It's kind of a kitschy line, but what we do is we first look at a country's imperatives. We look at the things a country must do to survive. You then get a sense of the country's capabilities and its constraints. If the United States, for instance, needs to control the Mississippi River in 1803, what abilities does the United States have to do that? What enemies does it face? What technological or whatever else constraints does it face on its activity? What you do is, especially in a situation where there's conflict between two different nation states, you look at the different strategic imperatives, you look at the different capabilities on both sides, and you look at the constraints on both sides, and you try to model what each side is going to do. And what you learn at the end of the day is that most individual leaders, we ascribe to them a lot of power, but they're actually very limited. They're choosing from a very limited set of options. They have things that their country must do, and they have many things that they simply can't do no matter how much they want to do them. And in that space between what is possible and what must be done is usually where our predictions are accurate.
Well, Jacob, this is a fascinating special report. I would encourage all of our viewers to get it. Really appreciate your time and your insights today.
Thank you for joining me. It was nice talking to you.